Okay, good afternoon or good morning to some of you. And welcome to the 6th session of the Spring 2020 Sunoikisis Digital Classics program. This is the first of 2 sessions on tree banking, and we'll be talking about the process of annotating tree banks, which is to say morpho-syntactic annotation of Greek and Latin texts. And we're joined today by Vanessa Gorman from the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, and Polina Yordanova from the University of Helsinki, both of them are on the screen. And the way I think this is going to go is that Vanessa is going to start by giving us an introduction to the dependency grammar and tree banking in from the grammatical perspective, and then Polly is going to give us a hands-on demo of the Arethusa annotation tool, which is the most commonly used tool for annotating Greek and Latin tree banks. And then at the end, we'll have a little bit of discussion on what you can do with some of these tree banks, but not too much, because in 2 weeks' time, we'll be joined again by 2 other presenters to talk about the use of tree banks and querying of tree banks. So we'll do that in more detail then. But I will now hand over to Vanessa, who I think is starting us off.
Hi, I'm Vanessa Gorman. I'm a professor of history at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. I have a PhD in classics from Penn, back in the day when I studied with John Graham and Martin Ostwald. I've been doing Greek trees for 6 years now, and I have put up on GitHub a repository of some more than 500,000 tokens of Greek prose hand analyzed that are hand annotated that people are starting to use. So I'm very excited about that. I want people to use this. So I've been using this program from the beginning, and I helped develop it. So I want to talk about just sort of some of the basics of dependency syntax. So let me go to my PowerPoint. Greek dependency syntax labels. Polly's going to show you how to actually use the Perseus. But the Perseus is a wonderful site that allows us to make these grammatical trees. And I do it in a pretty simple fashion. I use the old set of labels. But dependency syntax is opposed to what's called constituency syntax or constituency grammar. It's just a simple system of showing relationships between words in a sentence. And I like it because it is simpler than Chomsky's grammar. You can learn it very quickly and apply it very quickly. And also, it's used internationally on various languages. So one thing you can do is compare between languages, and it works better for sentences in which you don't have a linear word order like Greek or Latin. So the basic principle behind it is that a single word anchors the entire sentence, and usually it is the main verb called a predicate, or a coordinating conjunction with several main verbs, as you see on the right, a kai, the word and. Every word in the tree is located within the syntax of the whole sentence. So you cannot hide. You cannot just translate the words and rearrange them to make a sentence. You have to know how the whole sentence functions. So each word is hung on a single parent, as we call them. So athenaioi is hung on the main verb. There's only one line going up from each word, whereas you can have many children. There's a potentially infinite number of children in the for each word. The relationship, which is literally the relationship between child and parent, is labeled in every situation. So you can see here's the predicate up here. This kai is function as a coordinator. Here's our subject. And what I'm going to go through is these labels and how we arrive at them. I use the Prague tag set. There's a much more complicated 2.0, which is the Smythe tag set, which has many, many, many more variations. I love the Prague tag set because we can translate it between different different languages. So we can study different languages and compare them to each other. And it's very simple, straightforward. You learn it very quickly. It's also what I've been using since the beginning. So there you go. There's only 20 possible relationships tags in the Prague tag set. And of them, 3 are used just for punctuation. So the aux, x is a comma, aux K is whatever ends the sentence, and an aux G is bracketing punctuation. These are all added in by editors, so we just sort of toss them aside and don't worry about them. They don't form part of the tree unless you need them as a necessary element. Two are rarely or never occur in Greek. Sorry, that's the wrong two. There we go. The auxiliary verb and the reflexive passive rarely occur in Greek. The auxiliary verb occurs at times. It's much more common in Latin, of course. And then two are always labeled the same way, which is a preposition is always an aux P. You never vary it. A subordinating conjunction is always an aux C. You never vary its label. So there's really not that many things to choose from. Two are labeling coordinating elements and apposing elements. Usually it's a comma that we use to appose two elements in a sentence. And 11 are the real choices when you have a generic word in your sentence. So the main verb is the predicative or the predicate, and it's labeled as such, and it's hung on the root. So the watcher was signaling is the main verb of the sentence. Now, in dependency syntax, the idea is that verbs have something called valency. And I've never seen a really detailed explanation of this in Greek, but if you want to see it in Latin, go to anything written by Harm Pinkster, because his new Latin syntax is amazing. The idea in dependency grammar is that verbs require certain elements, and these are called the arguments of the verb. And a verb can require 0, 1, 2, or 3 elements. I would sometimes argue 4, but Pinkster doesn't go that way, and I follow him, so there you go. The lone argument of a monovalent verb, or the first argument of those who take 2 or 3 valencies, is labeled as the subject. So just plain SBJ. We're used to seeing this as the subject of any verb, right? That's not usually a problem. The king died. The army was victorious. These are both monovalent verbs. The king died doesn't require any other information. The army was victorious does not require any other arguments. And so we hang that as the subject on the predicate, and it's, there you go. So the watcher was signaling. Additional arguments are called one of 3 things. They can be an object, and here we throw together things that in English we usually call either direct or indirect objects, but these are necessary elements for the verb. If you give a gift, you have to be giving it to someone, right? These can include prepositional phrases. It can include many things other than nouns. So don't mix up part of speech with relation labels. Predicate nominative with copular verbs and object complements. Let me show you what those are. So 2 arguments. Pericles governed the empire. Pretty straightforward. You have a subject, you have an object. The Ionians decided to obey the king. You have a subject and an object. This verb that is an object also takes an object, the king. A subject in a pronoun, the woman was Pericles' wife, the army was in danger. So there's a preposition that's acting as the predicate nominative, right? With the copular verb to be, to become, any of these. The objects, there can be no more than 2 objects per verb. So he ordered the ships to sail around. If you're ordering them to do something, you have to order someone. Predicate nominative are the complements of the subject. So this also functions with passive verbs. Here's a case where we have Mindaris and Pharnabates were in Cyzicus. It's within a subordinate clause, but we still have the same thing happening. You can get this with some passives as well. A 3-argument verb takes one of several forms. Usually it's a subject, object, object, right? The god gave them victory. The merchant loaded his ships with many jars. I mean, we might say that's something else adverbial, but in fact, you can't load your ship unless you load it with something. It's necessary to complete the meaning of the verb. There's also this thing called an object complement, and this is if you make someone something. So the Athenians selected him general, right? They made him general. So the him is the object and the general is the object complement. And we see these a lot in Greek. So they offered the pilots and the others as witnesses. So they made these men witnesses, is essentially how to think of this. So object complement is another kind of necessary argument, especially with verbs of making or electing or establishing. There are also a few zero valency verbs, not many. It is raining, it is thundering. There is no it in these sentences. It just, that's how we say it. So there are very, very few of these, and they seem to have to do with weather mostly. Subordinate verbs also take subjects and objects. So you're going to see, you could see a pile of objects on top of each other. In this case, we have a subordinate clause that's modifying Alcibiades, and you've got objects down here. You've got, here's a nice participle saying. He said that the king ordered him to make war on the Athenians. So the king is in the accusative, the subject of the infinitive, as part of this indirect speech, right? And so here we have, you have to label these to know which one is which. Adverbs are additional information, optional information, not necessary arguments. And again, these can take many, many forms. There are just the typical things that we label as adverb. And this is the only relation label that is also a part of speech label. So this is the only overlap between the two categories. Then, at night, nearby, afterwards, very, etc. All these sorts of things. So the things around Miletus were fought in this way. There's an adverb. The subject is just ta, because the things, and they're the things around Miletus. Okay, so adverbs can be participles, they can be prepositional phrases. If it is not necessary to the argument of the verb or describing the noun, it's an adverb. So in this case, here's a great sentence with lots of prepositions. The Athenians fought. That's your main sentence. But the rest of this information is all additional. It's all adverbial for them. So they fought near Abydos. They fought along the beach. They fought from morning until evening. None of these are necessary to complete the meaning of the verb fought a sea battle, right? There would be an assumed object of fought the sea battle in the sense that you fight against someone, but that's not expressed. And it's perfectly fine to know that there needs to be another argument that is simply not expressed. We do that all the time. Noun phrases, likewise, we've seen dependencies from verbs that can be subjects, objects, ocomps, penoms, adverbs. Nouns also have lots of dependencies to make up the noun phrase, and these likewise can take many forms. We think of adjectives as modifying nouns, and the fact is a lot of other things can too. Participles, you have to make a value judgment. Is this something necessary to define the noun, in which case it's an attribute, or is it additional information on the verb, in which case it's an adverb? Prepositional phrases, you can talk about the book on the table is red while the book on the floor is blue. In that instance, these are necessary elements to define the noun, so they would be labeled as attributes. Adverbs can actually modify nouns. So we see this in Greek in phrases like men now as opposed to men then. So we'll get adverbs hanging on nouns or articles. And this happens not uncommonly in Greek. These are all labeled as ATR, so attributive. I tell my students, just think of that as adjectival, is essentially what it means, right? Attributive, it's labeling a noun. So words that specify or delimit or describe their head, including the article. So in this sentence, we have the watcher signal to the generals, the watcher of the Athenians signal to the generals. So these words are all labeled as attributes down here. Whereas the preposition or the participle here is not necessary to, it's not the watcher who was looking. It is an adverbial aside with this participle when he saw them, right? Verbal attributes are trickier. These are harder to define, but what I've basically come up with over time is that they agree with a noun morphologically, but they also somehow qualify the function of the verb. Now that sounds confusing until you start looking at the examples. I drink my coffee hot. Hot modifies coffee, but I'm not saying I drink my hot coffee. I'm saying when I drink it, I want it to be hot. So this is what we call an ATV. We use ATV when there is an antecedent, there's a noun to hang it on or a nominal to hang it on. We use ATVV when it has to stand for the nominal. So it's the same thing, it just whether there's an antecedent or not. So I'm going to sand the floor smooth, that is until it is smooth, not I'm sanding the smooth floor. This sentence I gave you, he captured one man alive. It's not that he captured a live man and, one live man and 10 dead men. No, he captured one man alive. So that makes that an ATV. So there are things that you have to kind of think about. He was the first to do something would be an ATV if first modifies he. So it's times when you get these what seem to be attributes, but they also qualify the verb. Suffixes are possible labels when elements are connected or apposed to each other. So elements that are conjoined receive the suffix _co. Suffix elements in apposition are _ap. You can also have apco. So to show you what I'm talking about, here's a good sentence that has both. Notice, he says, this, that. You see this a lot in the orators, right? Notice this, that. This and then the clause that follows are the same thing. So you hang them on the comma between it as a positive, and a positive label is almost always put on a comma. You simply change the x to a comma, to an apo. And then the two elements get this suffix _ap, so that you know that they are acting as the object, but they are apposed to each other. And then we have over here a coordination. So Kai's coordinating, and it's coordinating many and worthy. Many and worthy men of the citizens. We would say in English, many worthy citizens. So you can see in one sentence both kinds of structures. And if this were opposed to two elements, then they would be apcos, as we call them. Some words are functional bridges. They always are labeled in the same way. So every preposition itself is always an aux P. You transfer whatever it's doing in the sentence down to its object. Coordinating conjunctions are the same. There are always labeled as coords, and you always just transfer it down to the subject. Subordinating conjunctions are always aux si, when, since, because, although. Sentence adverbs and emphasizing particles that we're about to talk about. These words are never given suffixes. Instead, you put the suffix on whatever's hanging on them, as it were. So here's an example that prepositional phrases are functional bridges. So the prepositions themselves do not change their label no matter what. They're always just aux P. Here's a case where you have the coordinate, so you have predcos, but then you have a coordinated subject hanging off of the first verb, but you don't label this as a co. You label, you take it down to whatever's hanging off of it. So these sentences can get pretty complex. I've seen sentences 150, 160 words sometimes, but you just take it one phrase at a time and sort it out. Sentence adverbials, of course, are very, very common in Greek and also fairly common in Latin. By category, they are particles, which is a subcategory of adverbs. And so you label their part of speech as adverb. But sentence adverbials usually apply to the whole sentence. So particularly, these are the connectives at the beginning or postpositively located at the beginning of a sentence. They include coordinators in a series. With a series of coordinators, you hang everything off the last element of the coordinators and then hang the others as aux y's on that coordinator. So if you have kai, 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 you hang all the earlier kais on the last one. Also, clauses that express some kind of aside, like the author's attitude, as they say, to make a long story short. When we have a direct speech within a sentence, the verb of saying is usually hung as an aux y. So here we have the word but, de, right? And also both and, tack high, so that the both hangs on the and as an aux y. Emphasizing particles are a little trickier. Aux z's, these are things that emphasize one particular word, typically, especially the negations, any not or version of not. Also, kai meaning also, words like especially or only. You're never wrong if you call it an adverb, but certain short particles typically will call aux z's and hang on words other than the verbs themselves. So also there, right? We separate the K, the kappa off so that we can treat it separately. About 300. So hos here is functioning as an aux z, whereas de at the beginning of the sentence hangs on the chi. External dependency. This is pretty obvious. This is used for things like vocatives and asides and interjections, mostly vocatives and interjections. So, oh, my Milesian men, the Milesian is vocative. It's labeled as an exd, and the O on the front of it is an aux z, an emphasizing particle. So here's a nice example just to show you a slightly more complex sentence that I pulled out of Xenophon's Hellenica. So we have the main sentence is actually quite short. He would not receive them. Then you move on to a genitive absolute, which typically hangs as an adverb. So here we have two verbs of your genitive absolute. So it hangs on the chi as adverbials hanging on the main verb of the sentence. Tissaphernes is the subject of the genitive absolute. That leads into an indirect speech, right? Saying that he would see. One side of the indirect speech is a relative clause. And what relative clauses, you hang on their antecedent as an attribute, as a rule, okay? However, in this sentence, there is no attribute for the clause. So you hang the clause as if it were the attribute. The main verb of the clause becomes whatever the antecedent would have been. So in this case, see the things he himself was doing. We don't have a word for the things. So we hang the verb as if it were that word. And then finally, we also have a nice purpose clause, which goes on quite a ways, starting with an aux c that introduces subordinate clauses. Then we have another coordination here. What you can't see from here, but Polly will talk about, is the verb is not given twice, so you actually have to add it in or add in a blank node if you don't know what the verb is. But Arethusa allows you to supply elided words very nicely. So that's and it shows it by keeping it in a smaller font so you don't confuse yourself. So here's some helpful links. If you're doing tree banks, these are the guidelines to the 1.1, the simpler prog tag set. I've added some hints, some difficult constructions I've come across over the years that I've just picked a way to tree them and have written it down. I've also am developing an online Greek course based on using digital tools like Alphaeus rather than rote memorization to learn ancient Greek that I hope people will start accessing. It should be in good shape in about a year, but it's got the simple sentence almost finished now. And then there's also a playlist on YouTube of various Greek tree bank instructions, some if you know Greek already and some if you don't. So that's my part of this initial presentation. So I'm going to turn it back over to Gabby.
Well, just very quickly, thank you. That was possibly the clearest introduction to tree banking I've seen. I'm in danger of understanding it. So one thing just to note very quickly is that there was a lot in that, and if you're watching this and thinking, well, I haven't memorized all that yet, those slides are downloadable from the session page. You will need to go back over them and look at them in a little bit more detail, look at them a little bit more slowly, and when you come across your sentences, you'll want to flick back, look at some of the slides, also look at the guidelines, which have a little bit more detail and a few more examples, and work through that. So you know, that's a really useful reference material, rather than assuming that at this point you've remembered everything.
And Gabby, I have walked through a lot of this on other videos that they can look at. A lot of what Polly's about to do, I've also done for Greek. And so explore my YouTube channel, because there are a bunch of things there that could be useful.
And there's links to all that on the session page as well.
And also just get in touch with me, because I'm happy to help people learn how to do tree banks. I mean, it's like playing a computer game. It's very addictive. It's a lot of fun, and your knowledge of Greek only improves.
Yeah. Absolutely. And also just to note that if you're watching this and you were planning on tree banking Latin and you're slightly off-put by the fact that it's all in Greek so far, at least some of the examples that Polly's about to show us now will be using Latin as that. The rules are very, very similar between Greek and Latin, as Vanessa said, and so it's quite easy to map from one to the other. So we should be able to use this session whichever language you're interested in working on. If you're interested in tree banking a language other than Greek and Latin, that's a little bit more complicated. We might talk about that very briefly at the end, but that's not quite as straightforward as you know, doing what we're doing and mapping it to another language. But okay, so I guess I'll hand over to Polly.
Thank you, Gabby, and thank you, Vanessa. That was really very clearly. And I urge our viewers to go and check your YouTube channel, because everything that I'm supposed to cram in the next half an hour, and I'm going to find it very difficult to do that, they can view in a very steady and well-paced manner on your channel. So go and check that out once you've decided you want to do tree banking. So I'm going to show you now how to actually create these lovely trees and get addicted to tree banking. When you go on the session outline and you scroll to the end, you can find the link which will take you to the annotating environment of Perseus. You will be urged to create an account if you haven't used this service before. You can use one of these account providers and simply log in. So when you do, you will be taken to a page that looks quite similar to this one, but it most probably will not have as many things here. I've been doing this for a long time, and so I have a lot of things in my workspace. Yours will be empty. So the way to fill it up is to click on the green button, New Tree Bank Annotation, and you'll be taken to this window where you can choose the text that you want to be using with. Now I'm going to show you 3 ways that you can import text into Arethusa, starting from the bottom up. You can go and check out the text available in the Perseus digital library. You can pick a language of your choice, find your favorite author, and go to whatever it is that you want to be tree banking from him. And if you scroll to the end of the page, you will see a tiny create tree back link. That's when you click and you wait a little bit or a little longer, you will see the text imported from Perseus directly in this input box. But say you are done exploring and you already know what is the text that you want to be using, and you directly want to jump to Caesar and the Bello Gallico. So you can choose this, you can say which book and chapter and even section you want to do, in case you don't want to do the whole chapter, but just 3 sentences, let's say. And if you click on retrieve, again, these 3 sentences will be added here. There is another way to do that. In case the text that you're interested in does not exist in Perseus, And I'm just going to click on edit here so that I can show the difference afterwards. You can directly copy and paste in this input text box. So this is what I'm going to do because I've prepared a little surprise for you. Here, the text is automatically recognized as Latin. The text direction is also set to left and right. And we are just about ready to start. I just want to point your attention to this rather inconspicuously looking link over here that will be needed at the end of my presentation so that I show you how to do some semantic annotations that is also possible according to the new guidelines. Probably this is also a good moment to point that in Vanessa's slides, the guidelines 1.1 were referenced, and there is a second version of the Greek guidelines, which can be found in the class outline. This is the one that we've linked to. And there you will find some things which might be a little different than what Vanessa has shown, but again, this is all a matter of formalism and a matter of choosing how to represent different structures. So pick one and stick with it and you should be fine. So I'm just going to click on the edit button. And I am taken now to the annotating environment. Let me give you a little demonstration what this contains. So it's set to Bulgarian. Sorry, let me switch that to English. So up here we have the number of sentence and the navigation bar, which allows us to go through the sentences in our annotation. We have the save button, which you will have to use very often. We have the download annotation, which will download the Treebank XML that you will be creating as you're annotating. We have, of course, the very useful undo and redo buttons, and the help button, which is often overlooked, but which I urge you to go and check out because it contains lots of interesting things. So this is the sentence field where the sentence is displayed as it is visible in the text. Here we have the tree box where you will be building the tree. And here we have the different tabs which are responsible for different parts of the Treebank annotation. So we have morphology, relation for the relation labels that you saw in Vanessa's presentation, AT, which is a tablet that we will be using in order to create artificial tokens. And then we have a bunch of other tabs which you might never end up using. So we might tidy up a little bit this space by clicking on this gear here. And if you click on the name of the tab, you can deselect it and it disappears. So that's useful in order to keep it nice and tidy. So there are various ways in which you can start creating your tree. The three things that you need to do are to annotate the morphology, create the structure of the tree, and give it the labels. And you can do those in every order that you prefer. I'm going to show you how I do it. I usually start by assigning the morphology. So we can click on a word and look how it is colored in yellow now. This means that this word is selected. And if I try to click on any other word now, this will set a dependency relation between them, which is not something we want to do just yet, and particularly not in this order. So we can make use of the undo button. Look how the words that I've interacted with are now in the tree box. That's okay, they're fine there. I haven't said anything about these words yet. It's a clean slate. It's just Arethusa's way to show me that I have interacted with them somehow. So if a word is yellow and you want to deselect it because you want to click on another word, you have to use either the escape button, and notice how the buttons that I'm pressing appear here, or alternatively the enter button. And like this, you can proceed clicking on another word. So I'm going to start by choosing the morphological annotation for this preposition. Arethusa is using Perseus to Morpheus, which provides us with suggestions for the morphological annotation. For cases like prepositions, we only have one option, of course. And when I click on that, we see how this word changed colors. This is one very, very useful feature that Arethusa has, the different coloring of the different parts of speech. So if you have a longer sentence, you can just, by the first glance that you take on it, see which are the parts of speech there, find where the main verb is. This is kind of slow, and as I said, I have very limited time. So if there were a way to make this faster, that would have been great, and fortunately there is. So if you click again on the gear, which represent the settings in morphology, you can choose the pre-select option, which will urge Morpheus to pick for you the most appropriate form. Well, appropriate according to its algorithms and not always according to us as annotators. So we have to keep watch on what is being selected. And here, as you see, it's notifying me that 2 of my 9 words remained unused. So no morphological annotation has been done for them. These are the Helvetius and Orgetorix words, and usually Morpheus is not really good with proper names. If you want to annotate them once and always have them suggested by Morpheus, you can click on the Store Preferences option, which will then give you as the first options in that list of things that a word can be, the things that you have selected last. So as I said, Apple is pretty clear, but if we click on something like Nobilissimus, we see that we have, well, 2 options. And if you're not sure how to read this and you want to see a more detailed version of it, you can click on the selection and there you see it explicitly explained. You can also check the lexical inventory in a dictionary of your choice, which is super handy when you are treebanking and not sure of what something means. So for words which Morpheus does not recognize, we need to create new forms though. So we are using the lemma, we are saying the part of speech, and when I choose noun, we can see that different options are then given to me. If I had chosen something else, like a verb, these drop-down menus would change. So this is again a very useful way in which Arethusa guides your annotation. But we have a noun in singular, in plural, which is masculine, and it's in the accusative. And then we click the Save button, and this form is now added. And since I'm storing my preferences, next time I stumble across Helvetius, this will be suggested as the annotation option. And we can very quickly do the same for Orgetorix. Again, choosing the appropriate annotation. But then we see that Morpheus hasn't done a pretty fantastic job annotating our morphology because it has annotated this adverb as an adjective. And this is not something that we want to do. So if we don't see the correct answer within the options that Morpheus gives us, we can create a new form. The convention in the Latin guidelines is to use the adjective lemma and give the part of speech adverb. And so see how it changed color. So when we are happy with morphology, it's always a good idea to save, especially if you're about to go chat to someone, go grab some snacks, or in any other way be away from Arethusa. You can be expelled from the annotating environment. If this ever happens, don't try to reload the page because you will lose your annotation. Just open another window and sign in again, and then you can reload this and everything should be fine. So now we can proceed with making the tree. As we would do in any proper traditional Latin class, we can start with the main verb, click on it, and then without dragging, just clicking once here and then clicking again on root, we can set the dependency between this word and the root. As I probably forgot to mention early on, these 2 fields are linked. So you see if I hover over a word here, it also gets selected here and vice versa. So when I click on the subject of that sentence, I can set the dependency with the final verb either by clicking here or here. Both work the exact same way. So we have the subject dealt with. Now we can deal with this prepositional phrase. As Vanessa already explained, prepositions are used as these functional bridges, so they are heading the noun phrase. And now we have 2 predicate nominatives that we have to deal with. As it was already mentioned, since they are coordinated, they need to depend under their coordinator. And this is a good moment for me to show you how the multiple selection works in Arethusa. So you can click on something, hold the control button and click on something else. And then both of these words are selected without setting a dependency between them, which is great. then we can click on their coordinator and take the coordinator and put it under the verb. Now, what we do with longe might seem a bit counterintuitive in the beginning, but you'll get the hang of it as it goes. Since it's something modifying both words, it doesn't go under either one of them, but it goes under the coordinator. And we can be more explicit about what the function is when we are setting the labels. So we see we have 0 unused tokens. That is good. If I had omitted one of these words, for example, if I disconnect this one, you see how it says 1 unused, and I can highlight the unused token. This is very handy for longer sentences where you're not exactly sure how many of the sentence tokens you've dealt with. So now that we have a nice, pretty tree, we can save it and start adding the relation tokens. We can do that from the relation tab, or alternatively by right-clicking on a word here or here and choosing an option from the drop-down menu. So for the main verb, it's pretty clear. This is the pred of the sentence. Then the subject, and I'll keep on switching styles so that you get familiar with both of them, styles of annotation, that is. That's pretty clear that this is the subject. This is a coordinator, again, pretty straightforward. For output, we can choose this is a preposition because it can not be anything else. And then, again, we can try a more advanced function of Arethusa with these two things, which we know that will be having the same relation label. We can click on both of them. And when we're in the relation tab, we can pick the advanced mode in the settings and set one label for both of them and click apply. Now, for just 2 words, it seems like it's an extra feature here, but if you have a really long Greek sentence, you can select all of your articles and give them the attribute relation on one go, which is great. So for apud Helvetios, I don't really think this is a necessary argument of the verb. I don't think the sentence would become ungrammatical if this were missing from it. So I can say that it is an adverb. And longe, in my interpretation, is actually a word that is emphasizing the meaning of these 2 superlatives. So I could say that it's an adverb and stay in the safe zone, but I actually am going to say that this is an auxi, an emphasizing word. So now that all words have their respective relations, we can save. And as you probably noticed in the beginning, they all had the nil relation here. Our purpose is to not leave a single word without a relation assigned to it. Okay, so we're ready with the tree, and we can move to the next one via this arrow. But this tree does not seem as nice as the previous one because it has some things in it that I don't want to be seeing. If this thing happens to you too, unfortunately, you cannot edit the sentence as it is here in the annotation environment. You have to go to the underlying XML. And this gives me a chance to show you what Arethusa is actually hiding from us in this lovely user interface. Remember to save before you exit back to your Perseus environment. This is how the publication of your annotation will look like. I'm just going to do a brief digression into explaining what these things are all about. Here you have the overview where you can delete your annotation from if you need to, or download a copy, or submit it to a board of your choice that have people review it for you. Or we have the edit, which is where we can get to that annotation environment from. Edit XML, I'll show you in a minute. Another useful thing here is change title, because this other annotation that I created had this title already imported for it from the Perseus digital library. But the one which I made from copying and pasting has this generic title, which is very, very unhelpful. If you give your annotations a name that is useful, you can then filter for the name and search, for example, all the things that we've treebanked from Caesar or Aphthonius, for example. Or you can even search for all of your Latin annotations. So keeping your annotations named nice and consistently is very good. So this is where you change your title from. I'm going to call this one Memo, Caesar, and update. So finally going to editing the XML. You have already been presented with some XML, so this shouldn't seem scary to you at all. It's just a very simple structure that has sentence elements, with each word in the sentence being a word element. The ID represents its place in the word order, the form, self-explanatory, the form that is attested in that sentence. Then we have the lemma as the thing that you will find in the dictionary. The post tag is the attribute that is responsible for the morphological annotation. So you have this string of positions, and each position represents a certain feature of the morphological annotation. You don't need to remember those by heart until you start querying your tree banks, but this is a problem to be dealt with next week. Then we have the relation that we have been setting, and the head attribute, which represents the parent that these words have. Output's parent is word number 5. That is the main verb fluid, and this is about right. This is what we did when annotating. And you see, for the sentences that I have not annotated, all of these attributes are empty. So, second sentence has some punctuation that I don't like, so I want to get rid of it. In order to do that, we can simply grab the element and delete it from here too. And here for the pronomen, we have a dot that we can also get rid of if we don't want to see it. And see how the words are not really following a proper numeric order now. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. But you shouldn't go and manually fix all the word IDs, because Arethusa is clever, and when you click save, it automatically changes the word count for sentence too. The same would happen if, for example, we decide that we want to merge two sentences together. The sentence ends on a semicolon, no, on a colon, so we can take the closing element from the first sentence and the opening element of the first sentence, delete them, and although the words are not following in numeric order, when we click save, Arethusa will have taken care of all of that for us, and will also have renumbered our sentences. If you are nervous around XML, as it's quite normal to be in the beginning, and you delete by accident something that you shouldn't, and then you try to save, you will not be allowed to, because Arethusa doesn't save treebank XML that is not valid. So if something like this happens, you can just click on Edit XML, leave without changing anything, and you'll be back to a clean, nice, and valid XML. So because I see that I'm running quite ahead with the time, I can actually show you the second sentence already built. This is how it looks like. As you see, we have a very similar structure and a very similar relation positions as the ones that Vanessa showed you for Greek. This is why if you learn how to treebank in one language, it's pretty simple and straightforward to learn how to do that in the other language. But let's see what is happening here. We have a sentence that does not have a finite verb. It has an infinitive. So, oops, sorry. If we, you can also, by the way, type in the number sentence here, and it will get you where you need to be. So, by the rules of our guidelines, we cannot just click on the infinitive and attach it under the root. It needs to depend on the finite verb. And this is why we need to introduce an artificial token. So from this AT tab, we click on create. We can either give it a visual representation if we want to guess the word. If we don't give it anything, it will just give us a dummy token there. I prefer to keep things like this, so I'm not confused later when I read the sentence. You can choose the insertion point, And you can also choose whether to insert it before or after the word that you've clicked on. So in front of per facile, add token. And if we go back to the Morph tab and hover over that artificial token, you can see that this is part of the sentence number 3, but it does not have an actual ID. It does not have a set place in the sentence, like, for example, this one has. It's the 12th word in the sentence, because this does not actually exist. And this is wonderful for querying, because you don't want to be finding things that are not actually there. So back to the tree that is ready. This is how it looks like. And I really forgot to see how much time I have used already. So Gabby, can you please tell me how many minutes I have left?
You're fine. You've got at least 10 minutes.
Oh, that's perfect. So I can show you some cool stuff that you can do from the settings. So currently, and sorry, this keeps switching back to Bulgarian, but I've told it that this is my preferred language, and here we are. We can see that it's only giving us one sentence per view, but for some reason, for example, if you want to see the sentence in context, you might tell it to give you 2 or even 3 sentences. 10 is the maximum. So this will, and probably doing that on the sentence which is ready will be more useful. This will show us the continuous text, and you can switch between the trees from that bar over here. And sorry, this is displaced in my screen. I don't know why, but you're supposed to see that over there. Maybe if I try with 2 sentences instead, you'll like it more. Nope, not really. Well, you have to trust me on this one. So you will receive, if you do that, you will see 2 buttons over here that you can differentiate between. I think it's because I changed the proportions of my screen before we started this lecture that we cannot see those. But another thing that makes this option very useful is the selector tab, which allows us to perform queries directly in Arethusa, at least simple ones. We can search by token, and we can use regular expressions for that. So you can try out your knowledge in those here. We can also search by form. For example, we can search for nouns. And you see that the nouns in all 3 sentences are selected, which is kind of nice. We can also look for, well, nouns that are singular, and only those that satisfy these criteria will be selected. See that they're yellow, so that means that we can do stuff with them, we can annotate them. So if, for example, all of our adjectives are attributive, and we are fairly certain of that, we can give them all at once, remember, the ATR label that is currently hidden from us because of my screen resolution. Sorry about that. So this is something that is very, very cool to do. But if I just go back to 1, because that seemed to have disturbed Arethusa a little bit. Oh, now she shows us. See, this is how you change between the view of the trees. Well, I obviously haven't annotated many trees here, but here we can change the view. And right. And here we can do some really long sentences using Arethusa. This is an example from the first sentence of the Rosetta Stone, the Greek text, that I have had the pleasure of tree banking a few years ago. By the way, you can move the different components around and make your tree more visible. If the tree is that small, you can zoom into it by using your mouse scroll like that, and zoom out again with the mouse wheel. You can make it compact. Well, not this one really, because it's very big, but a smaller one maybe. And you can expand it. You can also turn it around. For some sentences, it's more useful to look at them in this side view, especially if you have a lot of parallel constructions in them and you want to see them like this side by side. You can also focus on a selection. For example, you want to see where Memphis is in the sentence, but you can't really locate it. And this selection takes you precisely where you want to be. You can give the perfect width of the tree. I prefer this view rather. And if for some reason you have moved your tree out of sight and you can't find it, zooming in and zooming out, this will center the tree back into your workspace. So in the beginning, I mentioned something about the different guidelines and the different tag sets that you can use. And I'm going to use my remaining 2 minutes to show you that. So this, if you decide to tree bank Greek and you follow the link that we've given you in the class outline, you will get to a point in these guidelines where the SG annotation is discussed. SG stands for Smart Grammar Tag Set, and it's a tag set that allows you to also annotate semantics. So it's something potentially very interesting. So if we take a Greek sentence and just put it in there, we can, again, clicking on that, it won't show if you don't click on that link. We can choose a different tag set system. So these are different ways of recording information, different formalism used to annotate the treebank trees. So we can use the ancient language dependency treebank. That's the one that Vanessa and I have been showing you so far, or the Harrington trees tag set, or the Pedalian, or Smart Grammar. If we edit that, we will see that we have one extra tab in our annotation side, which we did not have here in Latin. So this allows us to set the semantic annotation for a word, and I'm just going to show you one that is ready. So for example, for something which is the positional agent of the sentence, we have a way to say that from here. And again, this is a drop-down and guided selection. So if we choose something else, we are given different options. And this I have found in my student years that is a very good way to learn the functions of the different cases. And when you're done with your annotation, and then you want to perform queries on it, which you will learn next week, you can just click here, download it, wait a bit, and you will be presented with the treebank XML that you have created. And I suppose this is everything that I wanted to show you. I want to urge you to try it out yourself, spend some time looking at the guidelines, and just click around Arethusa. Don't leave a place unclicked, and just get the hang of creating the tree, and you will really see that it's a lot of fun and a very useful exercise. So, Vanessa, back to you.
Cool, thanks, Polly. So I think we're going to finish up with just a little bit of discussion of some of the ways people have used tree banks, and Vanessa was going to start us off with a couple of examples.
All right. Here we go. All right. So something, my husband and I have been working on this together for the last, since I started doing these 5 or 6 years. He learned how to use R, and we've been working on trying to identify authorship, especially of short texts. And most people in other languages who do this do it based on vocabulary, as many of you know, or n-grams. And this is not a very successful method when you use Greek, but what we found is that using the grammar is a very successful method. And I'd like to point you to these 2 articles, particularly this one that Bob published just this last year in DSH is really amazing. So one thing, what we do is we take the part of speech and the relation of a word and the part of speech and relation of its parent. And that's the only information we're working on. And then he's done lots of magic to get rid of sparsity and get it down to less than 1,000 variables. And we still have all kinds of things going on. But then we're looking at it in different ways. And I've treed multiple different prose authors. So here's an example of when we just threw it at the computer and said, you cluster it, which is a kind of a not a very sophisticated method of assigning authorship, but it's a good way of seeing whether it's working. And so we had the computer cluster, and if you can read the labels below, you see it's done a pretty good job. That is, how far up and down this line is tells you how distant the sections are from each other. And so you can see that the orators are grouped for the most part over on the left. There's a little Lysias thrown in. There's some Antiphon, some Demosthenes, some Aeschines. Thucydides is all by himself, which is interesting. Josephus, Plutarch, and Appian are sorry, Josephus and Plutarch mostly together. Appian, Xenophon, Herodotus, and a little Aeschines. This is the weird group, but again, this is not a very sophisticated method. And then Polybius, Diodorus, Dionysius here, all late Roman authors. So that's kind of interesting. So then we went a little further and trained the computer on 90% of an author and tested it on the following 10%. And I made sure we had at least 20,000 tokens of each author. And we got these astonishingly good results. On the left, you see what Ader has done just using vocabulary and n-grams, and he gets at best around 90%. And once you get below 2,000 tokens, it falls off a cliff. Whereas you can see we're getting better than 90% all the way down below 100 tokens. This is using the bag of words method of random sampling. We're now looking at trying to identify some spurious passages. So for example, Xenophon's Chiropaideia 8.8 is sometimes thought to be written by someone else. So we're looking at this, and this is book 1 and book 8 only of the Chiropaideia. And we decided to use a rolling window. So when he ran the clustering method, when he separated 8.8 out from the rest of the Chiropaideia, it never identified as Xenophon. It always identified as Thucydides, interestingly enough. So then he tried, what if it's variation within an author? And that's the next thing we're looking at. What's the variation within an author? So instead of using bag of words selection of random words, we're looking at hunks that we, say a hunk of 400 words, and you move it over 10 words, move it over 10 words, move it over 10 words, and do the whole work that way. And you see, when we did this with the Chiropaideia books 1 and 8, we found that book 8 is very different from the average. This is the black line. The black line is how different it is from the average. So there's some spikes here, but then there's also this big spike on book 1.2. And then he added how similar they were to 8.8, and we get the red line. And so, okay, these spikes don't concern me very much because they exist here as well. What's interesting is where the lines cross. And what we can conclude is that 1.2 looks much more like 8.8 than it looks like anything else in the work. And so there's a high likelihood that this was written by a different author. We're still exploring different ways of looking at it, because one question then becomes, how much does one author vary within himself? And so we ran Herodotus, Polybius, Thucydides. This is book 1 of Herodotus, book 1 of Thucydides, plus a little book 3 to bring up the token count. And then 1 and 2 of Polybius, and then the same Chiropaideia. And you see we have some interesting variation within some of these authors. And I looked at the high point at these authors, and for several of them, it's a weird aside, just as it is in the Chiropaideia 1.2. Polybius is really interesting because he's very smooth as a whole. He doesn't vary a whole lot. And then we have this one spike, which I want to investigate more. We just did this a couple of days ago, so it's pretty new. But this is the next question. I mean, with big hunks of an author, we're pretty confident we can tell whether it's genuine or not, or whether it is one of the known authors or not. But now we're trying to look at smaller contiguous hunks and to see where it's going. And then I also want to mention, you're going to be hearing from Toon van Hal in a couple of weeks. He's using my trees to train the computer to make trees. And then now I'm modifying some of his trees, or correcting them, if you will, and sending them back to him so he can further train his computer. Another thing that we're doing is there's no other big hand annotated repositories of trees that we know of, that we've been able to find. And Bob, my husband, is doing a project right now that hopefully will be out in a year or so, where he's using computer annotated trees of many different languages to see if our method of discriminated classification works as well on other languages like Russian and German, and I think he's doing Norwegian, I think Spanish. He wants to try English, but English is not a very interesting language in the sense it's not very inflected. So I don't think the results will be very good. As a whole, he's finding that he's getting similar results in other modern languages, about 25% less good than the ones in Greek, but then again, the computer parsing is about 25% less good. It's only about 75% accurate. So these are just some vague directions that we're taking our research in. And I want to emphasize that this bank of hand annotated Greek trees is available open access to anybody who wants to use it under a Creative Commons license. I just want to encourage people to use it in creative ways, because humanities has changed tremendously in the last few years. So back to Gabby.
Well, to everyone, yeah, that was that's really interesting. Polly, did you want to add anything about the way you're using your tree banks or anything briefly?
Well, I'm using my tree banks in order to find peculiar deviations of the standard word order patterns in papyri from the late Ptolemaic, early Roman period. And I have found that tree banking is the right tool for that, because it only gives me things in word order, but also shows me the dependencies between them. So any discontinuity is very easily discoverable. So really the possibilities are limited by your imagination.
And this is not very high tech, or it sounds like it's not a very high tech approach, but something that I've also seen some people talk about, including in Sunoikisis before, is looking at tree banks of different kinds of text, different authors, different languages, different types of passage in the same text, and just by looking at the tree bank on the screen, seeing whether it's particularly tall, very wide, how complex it is, just the shape of the tree bank can also give you information about the text, can help you say, well, this feels more like this than it feels like this, which has been an interesting thing to hear about.
Well, the other thing is, of course, the pedagogical uses in this Greek class that I'm setting up, which is in progress now. One of the next steps is to embed the trees. We're using the Alpheus tool so you can find meaning and morphology very quickly with the touch of a button. But we're also going to embed trees that I've made of all the sentences so that the students can then look at the structure of the sentence and understand, oh, I see how this fits together. Because for me, I'm not a person who's a born linguist like my husband is. I'm more a logic person. And so I see this tree and I see this visual, and it helps me tremendously to interpret what's going on. And frankly, I think anybody who does a critical edition or a commentary anymore should have accompanying trees of everything, because it's so, making the trees is a lot like making a commentary. You cannot hide. Every single word has to be accounted for.
Yeah, the Francesca Membrini paper on the reading list for this session is a good example of exactly that, just from a couple of sentences of Sophocles text. And yeah, tree banking it is exactly what Jeb or one of the early commentators were doing. They were looking at each word, trying to understand, making a decision. Do I call this attributive or adverbial? Well, that's a decision that the commentators have to make.
I like to say that making trees is about 98% very straightforward. And then that last 2% is fantastically puzzling, right? I've spent more time buried in Smythe trying to figure out obscure little things. I mean, I remember in grad school, I used to spend 3 hours trying to find an obscure verb form, and we don't have to do that anymore. We can do that at the touch of a button. So let's use that time to figure out how language works. That's kind of the point of my Greek course, right? Why memorize things you're never going to see, when instead you can use it to think about language as language in something that's transferable to any language and to computer learning and second language acquisition and all these other things. It's so much more interesting.
So while keeping half an eye on the YouTube chat box in case anyone watching live was wanting to ask any questions, which nobody has yet, and also keeping an eye on the clock, because I know you have to race off soon, Vanessa, to start your day's teaching. But I have one question which I've been asked in the past by students looking at tree banking, especially right at the start, when they often, they're looking at a passage of Greek or Latin and they start thinking, and they say, well, what's the correct way to annotate this particular word? And the response to which is always not, well, this is the correct way to do it, but how do you interpret that word? And that's the decision you make to that. And so the response sometimes has been, and I wondered how either of you might respond to this, is that if it's simply then that we can interpret it however we want, does that mean there's no right answer, no wrong answer? And does that can sort of be taken too far, of course, but how would you respond to that, either of you?
Well, I think with some constructions, it's very clear. If it's a subject, it's a subject, right? There's not a lot of ambiguity, but language is not straightforward and language is not unambiguous. And this is one reason I don't like using the Smythe tag set, because what's the difference between a partitive genitive and a genitive of material? If it's a piece of pie, it's a piece of pie. It is both a part and it's a material. And so I kind of like the simplicity of the Prague tag set, as we call it, because it allows for that. But there's also many sentences where you can take your choice how to hang it. You've got to just make a decision, or there's certain structures that there's no real instructions for. So, for example, I see Polly, and by the way, Polly, I learned a few things about using some buttons I hadn't noticed before, so I'm very happy about that.
I'm glad to hear that.
But for example, for AUX-Z, I tend to try to restrict it to just particles. Whereas I certainly have thought about how you used it for Lange, and I've thought about doing that. And sometimes you go back and forth, and sometimes you do it one way and then decide it's wrong and go back and fix it. And so this is where, hold on, my dog's about to bark, but I hope it's not too loud. Somebody just rang the doorbell. But this is where I use this, I make this tree banking tips. Hold on a second. Sorry.
That's okay.
That was inevitable.
Yeah,
that was
fine. It wasn't disruptive at all.
But this is why I keep this tree banking tips list, partly for myself, right? Because I don't remember how I handled this. And at some point, you just make an arbitrary decision. Every time I see this, I'm just going to do it this way. It may be right. It may be wrong. I'm not Harm Pinkster. I can't figure it out myself. I'm not this is. You have to see it as data for the future linguists and programmers of the world to sort out how to do it. I mean, the only way to figure valency of verbs is to look at all the verbs everywhere. And that's one thing we want to do in the future, actually, is make a valency dictionary of Greek verbs using all this data and letting the computer sort out the constructions that occur with them commonly, because that's the only way you can decide if it's necessary. So it's simple and it's complicated and it's beautiful.
Yeah. Polly, do you want to add anything to the question of whether there's such a thing as right and wrong answers?
I completely agree with Vanessa. In language, there is no black and white. There are lots of gray areas for some things. But as long as you try to be consistent with yourself, that's always a good idea. Later, when you try querying things, you realize that even with the deliberate efforts to have kept things consistently in a certain way, because we're human, we're not machines, we tend to make different decisions depending on very different things. For example, even the mood of the day. But yeah, having in mind that someone, maybe even you, will in future have to make use of that tree bank that you're creating is always a good idea.
But there's also the issue that there's sound and there's noise, and if I do something wrong, Bob keeps saying, oh, it'll just be noise. Don't worry about it. Because you can't be obsessive about this. And the idea is to use massive amounts of data, right? Use the corpus linguistics approach. And so, okay, I labeled that verbal adjective a different way last time, but I'm not going to try to find it. Also, frankly, since I've been doing it from virtually the beginning, the program changed a lot. And the earliest text I treed have mistakes that never occur later because the newer Arethusa is so much better. And they did such a great job with it. And I worked with them very closely while they were developing it to get some of these features and to sort out some of the problems. So it's really a fantastic program now.
Yeah. And as with anything, I guess if you're using the tree banks to find patterns, then when you drill down and you look at them closely, you're then looking at the text. You're not, the tree bank is not religion anymore at that point. It's, you know, it's helped you to find it, and then, you know, you make your own decisions about whether you agree with it and whether there's, you know, whether the rules of the prime dependency are meaningful or not in this particular case, and so forth.
Yeah, one thing we're trying to do, again, are many projects. Every time we think of one thing, we think of 10 more with these trees, because they open up all kinds of possibilities. But one thing we've done a little bit with is, okay, if this passage, the computer thinks it's Thucydides, what about it is the computer using to discriminate? And so we're finding, you know, you can drill down. It takes a while, but you can drill down and find these are the structures that the computer finds are good discriminators for Thucydides, as opposed to Herodotus, as opposed to Lysias, as opposed to Xenophon. And so this is a place I'd like to go someday in the future, but if I live long enough, that's, you know, it's just like I say, I've never been involved in a project that just spawns so many possibilities. I could name you I could keep 100 grad students busy with dissertations if I wanted to, you know, if I had them. It's just, it's wonderful, but it means the whole future is opening up in a whole new way.
Great. If anyone doesn't have any further questions or comments or anything you wanted to add to this discussion, I'm aware, as always, of the time. I'll a couple of seconds for either of you to jump in if you did. If not, then I'll thank you both very much again for an extremely clear and extremely lively presentation of tree banking. And I'm sure the students will very much enjoy working through the exercise. And just to say to the viewers, please join us next time. The sequence of the next couple is potentially confusing, but if we go by the numbers of the seminars, the next session will be another type of grammatical annotation. So this will be translation alignment and looking at the linguistic features can be brought out of that. And then following that will be another session on tree banking, which will be on using tree banks and querying tree banks that will be presented by Toon van Gaal and Francesco Mambrini, both of whom have been mentioned already today. So please join us for the next couple of sessions, and thank you both very much again. Bye.
Thank you for asking us. Nice to meet you both.